Hi, welcome to the XYChromies, Confidently Uncertain, show where two Army vets turned renewable energy engineers talk science, engineering, history, geopolitics, international relations, veteran issues, and everything in between. I just keep adding stuff, by the way. I'm your host, Pearson Guest. I'm joined as always by Richard Ellis. How's it going, Richard?
Coming to you live from Spring Break Central in the Pacific Northwest. This is the spring break of universities in this part of the country. I've
Nice.
taken the last four work days off, and I could go for another week.
That's good. Yeah, it's nice when you want to take some additional time off. I like you've switched the shirt out from to a new nice light Hawaiian blue, which is pleasant.
That's right.
I am
Yep.
not on spring break. That thing doesn't exist for me over here in the real world, as I'd say, outside of the scholastic schedule. But I'm on my weekend break, so uh, it's good to see you again. It's episode 43, and we have talked about a variety of things. Last week, we talked about self evaluation in your career. We talked about engineering, the difference between renewable energy engineers and electrical engineers, and the social differences between the two. And we talked about AI and LLMs also. The episode before, we talked about the history of Oregon, which was really cool. And before that, we were talking about the fall of the Republic. So, for all your viewers who are watching us, if you haven't seen those episodes, go ahead and check those out. They're pretty good. Um, and yeah, did I pose a question to you last time? I don't remember. Been trying to leave each episode with a fun question that like leads the conversation. Although last time I did, we talked about something completely different, which was fine. But yeah. um, I guess what I think I'll like to start off with is talking about this signal leak a little bit because I'd like to just put it into a frame of reference. I keep hearing one side say it's not that big of a deal, and then another side is acting like it is a big deal. Um, I'll put in my 2 cents from an infantryman's perspective, so really high up in the rung of the military echelons of power. Uh,
Before you get started, Pearson,
sure.
let's actually take a moment to stop down and say, in our current time, because this content may be experienced by someone far off into the future,
That's true.
um, in our current time, we have an administration that is in charge of our country's government who, um, through a series of interesting blunders, added a reporter from the Atlantic magazine to a group text chat. I've been added to these group chats before and they drive me crazy. I don't like them. But it turns out that this reporter was introduced to a chat where the exchange of the chat was between members of the administration talking about a tactical military mission, approving that mission, and the their position on who would benefit from it, and um, essentially following the guidance of our senior administrator, our executive in the Oval Office. And so you're about to comment on the fallout from a a conversation that was supposed to be a not for public consumption discussion about a tactical and strategic military mission where people would probably lose their lives at the other end of the consequences of this. And it was distributed to someone in the media who is a reporter and editor of a magazine. All right,
Yes.
go ahead, take off.
First, I want to say I appreciate that. It's good to level the context in the idea that someone might watch this later. And considering our viewership is slowly rising and by the tens, most likely, if people do watch our content, it will be from the future into the past. So I like that you add that context. Um, yeah, just to add a little bit more color to that, when we say these are members from the These are the senior most members of the administration. These are the people in the highest positions of power around the president, from the national security advisor to the secretary of state, to the vice president, to the head of our intelligence, our entire intelligence apparatus, Tulsi Gabbard, a Russian shill who's paid by Russia, by the way. I'll just throw that in real quick. So these weren't just like, low-level members that, that might have had like subcommittees or anything like that. So one, I'll say that. Second, the nature of this information was heavily classified. They've denied and waffled on this fact, but at the end of the day, it was classified. It wasn't just a lot of disturbing hoo-ah conversation with, a bunch of flags and emojis talking about how awesome they are and how kick-ass it was, which was bizarre to see in the first place. This highlighted specific weapon systems that were going to be used in this process. It talked about the agent. It name dropped the agents who were for working in the CIA that were being collaborated with to carry out this strike. And it had a phase-by-phase timeline laid out before the strike. This conversation happened about 2 hours before the strike took place. Of course, the journalist who was included on this, I believe his name was Goldberg, he was an editor at the Atlantic, he didn't release the information until after the strike had taken place because he has better ethics than the people on this call, apparently. And so I think that's the context I wanted to start off with. When I think of why this was a big deal, the first thing I think about is the people carrying out this strike. The pilots who are flying the, I think it was F-22s that were being used for this strike. Do you remember which flight weapon system it was?
I don't recall.
Anyways, we had some pilots. They were flying one of our many amazing aircraft that we have. Giving phase by phase of how this was going to be carried out immediately means that those pilots' lives were in actually far more greater danger than they ever would have been if this call hadn't been released, right? That was one thing that I thought of immediately. As information came out, there's a character that's been not talked about within this text chain that is by far the most interesting thing to me because, as you know, Richard, but our audience probably knows if they've tracked us at all, we've been talking about Russia's reach and Russia's influence within our, frankly, our administration, and potentially their just utter control of what we're up to right now. A guy named Steve Witkoff was in Moscow meeting with Putin and his officials while this text chain happened. Now, Signal, the app that was used, is a civilian app that is used by military personnel to have non-classified communications. We should say that. It is illegal for them to have classified communications on this app. It should be known that I believe I listened to a congressman, ex-Marine captain, who was saying, if they had had this conversation, he would have been fired immediately, from his job as a captain, and any corporal or anybody who's under the normal echelons of the military would have been fired for this immediately, for this breach of security. And Signal, and I'm not an expert on encryption, but Signal is end-to-end encrypted, which means that it's encrypted on my phone and the other person's phone, but the internal network between cloud and all of that stuff, there's no encryption there. Which means that if any of them were using Apple phones, which there's a high likelihood that some of them use Apple products, as 86% of the country has an Apple phone, or some ridiculous statistic like that. There's a smart AI cloud learning that is automatically turned on for every app you download. They would have had to manually go through and turn this off to stop the Apple AI from learning from the Signal app, aka gathering that data and storing it in the cloud. So Steve Witkoff was in Russia under Russian internet, Russian cloud, and we're talking about one of the most advanced cyber probing networks out there. The Russians know how to hack. He was there during this entire exchange that had occurred. So I'd like to kick off. I thought those were the two most alarming slash interesting facts, and then I have some other ones. But how about you, Richard? What did you find interesting or most disturbing, or just funny if it wasn't so sad?
I'm going to start off with let's acknowledge that you and I, if we were having an exchange like this as non commissioned officers,
Mm-hmm.
and we were talking about what we're going to be doing, uh, the tactical mission that we were on,
Yeah.
and I had included one of my friends from the media, you and I would be spending time at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. This is a prison. This is a detention center for service members. Um, so when we talk about how the rules apply to thee and not to me, this is a great example of this.
Yeah.
Now, in the history of our military, there have been um, service members who have acted in bad faith and stolen and transmitted uh, information about either missions or some strategic knowledge.
Yeah.
And there have also been service members who, just by being doofuses from some corner of the nation and not really understanding the implications of what they were doing, have done this.
Yeah, a couple
But
of years ago, that Discord guy, that guy who was bragging about stuff on Discord in like
yeah,
2022, 2021. Anyways, keep going. That one comes to mind
well,
most recently. If any of our viewers remember this incident, it happened the last 4 years. So, um,
isn't there a meme going around? It's been 0 days since someone shared strategic information on Warhammer forums. That type of thing.
yeah, exactly.
So we're a pretty big nation, and in many ways not full of a lot of very sophisticated people, it turns out. And so occasionally uh, we'll make some real blunders, and depending on how the staff judge advocate how this is adjudicated in a military um, law scenario, we may spend time in prison.
Yeah,
So we're going at this from a okay. The severity here, if you and I had done this, would be non-trivial.
yeah,
You and I
like at
would be
least 5 years. They hand out
yeah,
pretty heavy sentences for these type of things. I don't see us serving any less than 5, and it's probably that'll be
right.
more because when these sentences come out in the army, they're heavy-handed for a reason. It's to
Yeah.
stop this behavior in the future. Similarly, to if you lose a lot of sensitive equipment and stuff, the army can come down on you pretty heavily for these type of issues. Usually, it's more severe punishment than if you were on the civilian side. Not that there's like a direct equivalency between these two things, I should say. So,
So I found this discussion between Jeffrey Goldberg and Ann Applebaum. This is a video on YouTube. They're at a festival in New Orleans a couple of days ago, and um, Ann Applebaum is a she's a contributor to the Atlantic. She writes columns for the magazine, and Jeff Goldberg is an editor at the Atlantic. And so Jeff Goldberg is the civilian person who is included on this exchange of information, sensitive information,
by Waltz,
and
the head of the Department National Security, I believe he's the head of that department. So,
and so I mean I, I first of all I can't even wrap my mind around how this even happens, but that it did. Now we have this new interesting. We're in this brand new and interesting uh, paradigm that it's kind of it's kind of unknown. I mean, there have been times in history, in the nation's history, where the media had access to really interesting and sensitive material, and had the spine to go to the people that this would affect and say, "This is really interesting, and we would like to report on it. Is there any part of it you want us to redact?"
yeah,
And so Jeff Goldberg literally does this,
Mm-hmm.
and he talks about it in this interview with Ann Applebaum. By the way, Ann Applebaum, um, if you're interested in learning about how autocracy works and how the regimes function and that type of thing, she's an expert on this topic. So Ann is,
She recently did a special on this, an hour
yeah,
long special for one of the, I forget which magazine, but they do these where they have one person sit in a kind of a white background. I think I forget the
yeah,
medium that they report on, but I saw her talk about
yeah,
authoritarian regimes as an expert.
yeah. She's written a book on the subject, and I mean, just an interesting and compelling character in our time, and she just is really well prepared to discuss this exact topic.
Yeah.
And Jeff Goldberg is senior to her in the context of journalism,
Yeah.
and so she did basically interviews him, and uh, so Mr. Goldberg, contacts our national security advisor. Hey, I was included in this text chain. I don't think I was supposed to. This is interesting stuff. I'd like to publish this.
Yeah, what
Is there
can
anything
I
you want me
not
to
write?
redact?
Yeah. Yeah. What do
Yeah,
I have to exclude from this? I think he also prefaced it in the message. He wasn't going to include the name of the CIA agent or any of the other names that were included in there. So he
yeah,
pre-qualified. He was already not going to leave that sensitive information in there. I think during this
yeah.
exchange, I remember. Yeah.
And so I know that listening to these two people in this conversation, this was about a little under 30-minute long video on YouTube, and listening to them talk about this, it's like, well, let's accept that the these are people involved in the situation in a way where their bias has to be acknowledged. They are chiefly at the center of this from the civilian and media side,
Yeah.
and in ways that are really unbecoming of a American administration. Jeff Goldberg has been subsequently attacked and um, you know
Yes, we've heard
criticized.
the press secretary immediately. I all but say the commie editor in chief. She might as well be. It's very McCarthy esque the way that he's been talked about. The venom with which Pete Hegseth, who I hear is what is his whiskey? He's got a great name going around. What was it? Whiskey something. Oh God, I'm totally botching it, but it was great. Um, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So the or let's see. I'm going to try to gather my thoughts here because, of course, what did I try to do is, of course, I've seen this
Yeah.
this tag. Um, I do want to acknowledge that. Uh, so what's and Hegseth's role in the cabinet is
He's the head of the
Department of
Pentagon. I mean,
yeah
essentially, like
he's defense secretary. There we go.
defense secretary. Yes.
I I've really not had enough caffeine yet today, so I'm working on it. So, please
No,
forgive
that's
me.
totally okay.
we're, we're, we're it's Sunday. I've been off for a week. Anyhow, here we go. So our defense secretary served in the armed forces, and during his selection, I thought, well, this bodes well for how the Department of Defense will be operated, and I really felt like, wow, this is like a person who had um, contact with soldiers, and um, this is going to be someone who has a sense of what it means to serve. And you and I have talked before in the past about the role that alcohol plays in a service member's life. There are very few service members on active duty who are uh,
Clean and sober.
dry, sober.
Yeah. Not saying
They
they're
don't.
working performing their duties while they're drunk. That there's a difference, but when the
Yeah,
weekend hits up or that long, when any type of R&R spring break, I can tell you,
totally.
at least we were hitting the bottle like there might not be a tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. So we really drink deeply from the bottle of life,
Yes.
and so our Secretary of Defense has had issues with alcohol in the past, and so when we talk about these fun cheeky names to call him that are related to different types of liquors, boy, that's a complicated. I have complicated feelings about that because on the one hand, you know, he's in this position to really radically either change things about the armed forces in general or to have these, have this influence over a career that, I mean, I served for 8 years. It's never going to be a small part of my life. It was probably the most important 8 years of my life. It might be overshadowed by something in the future, but for now, it's still important. It was defining for me. And,
Yeah.
I'm apprehensive about playing into coming up with a cheeky thing to call that labels his past relationship with alcohol because
Well,
it's
yeah.
such a part of the service members' lives and it's so destructive in our lives depending on its influence and all these other factors.
So what I
He
think,
probably was.
yeah, I was going to say what I think you're experiencing is you have empathy.
Yeah,
You have empathy for the plight of the service member with alcohol, and
yeah,
from
totally.
that's a very human response, right? Of course, it's extremely human for us to make fun of the thing as well when the guy fucks up. I would say the distinction here is like what separates what should separate him from that in the first place is he served at Fox News after he served in the military. One, I'll say, as a contributor for a long period of
Exactly.
time. He's been slinging propaganda as a Fox News analyst, contributor, or whatever it is for a very long time.
Right.
Um, Being put, so he's not only in charge of just like how our military changes that happened in the military, it's the entire defense apparatus, the Pentagon,
Yeah.
everything, every aspect of our defense apparatus. He is in control. That's why he goes to NATO and he speaks at NATO and he speaks with all of our military allies. He has to speak to the Five Eyes in conjunction with Tulsi Gabbard.
Hmm.
And the reason we have Senate confirmations and all of these issues is because even if you've had a relationship with alcohol in the past, it could be complicated, but if it's still a problem, it should disqualify you from that job, frankly. And that's it's just whether or not it's a fault of him for having these demons or having this addiction. That's beside the point. Those
Yeah.
if your personal life and those personal issues are bleeding over into your public service for us, we have the right to not only ridicule but also audit and judge this person because the decisions that they're making are so immense and so consequential for our whole country that we can't
Yeah.
risk that of an alcoholic making these blunders. Not that he is solely responsible for all the blunders that were happening here, and who knows if he was drunk when this was happening or any of those things. That's kind of beside the point. I mean, the the fact that Nixon was wasted half the time when he was president is highly disturbing. And I'm guessing if we went back in history, there'd be a lot of drunk presidents in our past because we have such an interesting relationship with alcohol and substance abuse prior. Um,
Yeah.
but there's a difference between having an awkward relationship with alcohol and us being able to keep it to ourselves, contain that internally and not let that bleed over into our public life and our public sphere. I can speak for myself that, you know, it just wouldn't be appropriate if I was getting drunk at my job at all, right? Like if I, it's not appropriate for me to get drunk, wasted around my kids either, or any of those other things also, which I have did at definitely my first year of Ronan being around. It was like COVID, and I was drinking way too much wine and getting wasted by like 9 o'clock. And Sarah was like, "Dude, you need to get a handle of yourself. He's going to be taking notes in like half a year, right? My son would be roughly 2.
Yeah.
So I really had to cut that shit out. That's like a micro example of me having to get contained. When we're talking about the responsibility of our government and our defense, I the human response I totally can I get, but at the same time, it's just not appropriate. It's the same as um, the Supreme Court justice when his alcoholism got brought up. I forget which one he was. Brett, what is his name? Um, it's with a B. It's one of Trump's
More
appointees.
caffeine.
He had three. Yeah,
More caffeine is needed.
yeah, more caffeine. I don't remember his name, but yeah, he was. His drinking came up as a contentious issue during the confirmations for the Supreme Court justice position. Um, so that's my 2 cents on the drinking part. I think what was further disturbing was I understood that this administration is showing a public dislike of Europe, and we're trying to take a hard line against Europe. What was disturbing to me is that all of these people were texting in a private chain, and they have far more vitriol for our allies, our Western allies, than I ever could have imagined. And this wasn't, you know, this wasn't an act like what we think it is. Like, oh, they're projecting this. This is all part of their, playing tough. This was a true feeling of hatred towards our Western allies, not wanting them to have any wins. And that was extremely disturbing to me as well.
So what you're referring to, if I'm tracking correctly, is that so the mission that was being discussed had to do with the um, the faction of people that are in the country
The
of Yemen,
Yep, the Houthis.
which are creating problems for global shipping. So that's a if you look at a map of the world and you look at where Yemen is and the Horn of Africa and where the Red Sea is, this is essentially a kill box from a tactical perspective. The waters choke down to a small region,
Yeah.
and global shipping from Asia going to Europe travels through this Red Sea channel, through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean. This was a really the story of the Suez Canal is fascinating. I recommend learning more about it because it's actually one of these really important ideas that um, has major implications in global dynamics and the world that was before World War II.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about a faction of people who are, well, they're radical religious extremists, and that's putting it lightly.
But
They
they're
also have
pirates. They're
lots of
Yeah.
yeah, they also have lots of reasons to have beef with the Western world for any number of reasons. I might sound like I'm casting a little bit too much empathy toward them, but what they're doing is piracy and terrorism, and whatever they do, if they harm a vessel coming from in that transit from Asia to Europe or back again, um, what they're doing is having this really negative effect on Europeans and their commerce. And so when in this exchange between our senior administrators from the cabinet and Jeff Goldberg, seeing all of this transpire, one of the main things that emerges, again, aside from the fact that the application that they're using on the telephone is completely inappropriate for any type of conversation like this.
Yes.
Aside from that, one of the main things, and you were mentioning this transactional behavior that was brought up, this transactional attitude that was brought up, is that the Europeans are going to benefit from a tactical strike on the Houthis. It's in this conversation. The Europeans will benefit from this.
Yes.
They stand to be harmed.
Disproportionately is the idea
Yeah,
that global trade will benefit from this because the Houthis have had a chilling effect on the Red Sea, essentially. And
yeah.
the Biden administration has been carrying many strikes on the Houthis throughout their period of time
Mm-hmm.
in conjunction with the Israelis. This has happened over the last year or so. And this is another series of strikes that's been performed on the Houthis because of that chilling effect has remained. It's had a disproportionate effect on European trade, but
Yeah,
all trade has been affected by this. We still get
yeah.
3% of our goods that get shipped through there, and that's not even accounting for the follow-on goods that we're getting potentially from Europe, from our European trade allies. Down the line, some of these could be like
Right.
raw materials that they're getting, and then we're getting a refined material from Europe. From this whole entire chain. So I just wanted to add that context.
So when this attitude about this transactional attitude comes up, this is what you were mentioning.
Yeah.
They're talking about the imposition this is on our administration to defend the disproportionate effect on our European, literally allies. it, it pains me to say this. Literally, the coalition of allies that came together post World War II to create a world where human beings could engage in a, a, a global order that was no longer beggar thy neighbor. It was no longer a cutthroat. It's a pie is always shrinking attitude towards trade. It
Yeah.
was a pie is always growing attitude towards trade. It is a trade actually causes these great relations to happen between nations where everybody wins, right? It was an everybody can win
Yeah.
attitude that was developed after World War II because the attitude that people had before set up these world wars. They caused these world wars. They
Yeah.
created the circumstances for World War One. World War Two adjudicated the unfinished business of World War One.
Sure.
And look, setting aside the gargantuan loss of life in those loss of lives in those two world wars, what they definitely demonstrated for us in the modern era was that that type of attitude towards international trade and um, colonialism and the way that Europeans were extracting wealth from the rest of the world was bad. It was not working as a global world order and it had to be changed. And it took two world wars to affect that change.
Yeah.
Those allies that we're discussing that would benefit from a um, tactical strike on pirates and terrorists in the Red Sea. We are watching as the alliance with those friends is being eroded and will be destroyed and will probably be difficult, if not impossible, to ever build back. And that means that what we're also watching is what can only be a trend towards a reemergence of the pre-World War One
Global
world
order.
order
Yeah.
of trade and hostility between neighbors.
Yeah.
And that's one of the most assaulting aspects of this, aside from all the other assaulting aspects of this
Yeah.
exchange that took place and was recorded.
I mean, what stands out was I believe J.D. Vance and Hegseth were the most displayed the most hatred towards Europe, open hatred, indicating that they hated Europe. I think Hegseth said something like, "I hate to see them get any
Yeah.
wins." Um, J.D. Vance was in complete agreement of it. And then Stephen Miller, that little freaking rat who had to peek his little head out. Probably one of the most dangerous of all these people, by the way. Stephen Miller is just one of those people. He's one of those people who will never really be in the limelight very often. He is very effective in the shadows, writing policy, and I think he is one of Trump's closest confidants that he keeps around often. When you talk about the transactional nature, I think that's where I'm honing in. He was the one like, well, Europe needs to pay for this. We're going to have to find a way to extract something from Europe for this strike, after they've already done it, which is a weird way of doing business, art of the deal over here. Do the thing and then be like, hey, how come you haven't paid us for this? It's so funny watching our administration act like a mob, like the mob constantly. Every action is it's the Cohn family version of mobhood, right? And I say that because those are the lawyers that Trump's used before in the past, the Cohns, which are, they come from the mob. That's where they are from. Roy Cohn was his senior lawyer, and then Michael Cohen was the junior nephew or something like that. Anyways, so yeah, this mob-like behavior, and we say this erosion of our alliance, but this is like taking a pickaxe to it and actively trying to create a collapse. And it was disturbing to see that in private, I think was the most disturbing, because it meant, oh, this isn't just a show of like America first and like we're about, we don't care about our European allies. It's these people are all true believers in their hatred of Europe and frankly, their love of Russia. They're indicating their sympathy and love of Russia constantly is beyond disturbing to me. Having Trump triple down on Greenland, and talking about military, when Trump says something more than once, people need to start listening. Why have we not figured this man out yet? Like, it's playing it both sides, both ways. Oh, he's not that serious. Oh, he's serious. When he says things more than once, we have to take him seriously. We must take him seriously. So I know that's a abrupt button hook, but it's, I saw another headline where he's talking about Greenland again and security. How much access does Putin have to our White House is really always the question on my mind. I know I've asked this before, but it's how much access does he have? Is Tulsi Gabbard reporting to him directly? Is Steve Witkoff an agent now? Like, is he, coordinating with Russia? Putin rejected the ceasefire. He agreed to it and then bombed the energy facilities 3 hours later, right? And he has continued to reject the ceasefire. Now, Trump, before going into these negotiations about a month ago, indicated that he would have to do something naughty, like give the Ukrainians more arms or create more sanctions on Russia if they didn't agree to a ceasefire. But that time has come and gone, and nothing has happened yet. Now, one of the people I listened to, William Spaniel, Lines on Map guy, he indicated, don't listen to what leaders say, see what they do. And a point he had brought up before the peace talks had really started was that if Trump was serious about being tough on Russia, he would have had a bunch of arms prepared to be sent to Europe, to Ukraine right away, and go into the negotiation with a bunch of things in place for if it didn't go well, immediately would have shipped it, because Russia wouldn't respond unless you actually were willing to back up your threats, right? That was the whole idea. So William Spaniel had mentioned that, and he said that he didn't think Trump's was necessarily serious because there was no actual movement of arms. There was no shipment that was being put in place. There was no logistics behind potentially supplying Ukraine with a bunch more weapons or defense systems if the Russians didn't play ball. And so he said, well, we'll have to see, but be careful what we listen to as far as what Trump is saying, because we're not seeing action that's going to back it up. And it's been a month now since then. And it seems as though Russia's been more than happy to continue shelling away at Ukraine with no real indication of letting up. So how much is Putin laughing, or is Putin just laughing at himself because he's controlling our administration right now? Like I constantly play this game in my head is like, what level of control is it? Is it suggestive? Like, hey, Donald, keep it up. I love what you're doing. Just keep being hostile to Europe. I want you to be combative with Ukraine. Just keep that up. That's great. Hardline them. Or is it talking points? Is it step by step? Is there a bullet point? I don't know if, like, what I feel like Trump, it just needs to be suggestive, because I don't think he takes notes or would remember them that well. But what do you think?
Well, I've been accused of this in the past. I've had people level with me straight up, and they've said to me, Richard, you're a third party instigator.
Okay.
Which was kind of fun. It was kind of fun for me to find out that there was a terminology for what I was doing.
Okay.
Which was, this is the kind of take where there might be two parties who have adversarial relations, and then a third party is out there going, "Hey, you gonna let them talk to you like that? You gonna let them do that? I mean, they're punking you, dude." So the third party instigator energy here is pretty big, because I'm forgetting the reference. It's something that I had found and listened to. It was some interview with someone who had specific history with interpreters, or had worked as an interpreter, and spoke fluent Russian, and talks about these exchanges that our executive has with Russia's executive.
Yes.
And so they have these interactions, and essentially the leader of the Russian Federation is just kind of trolling our president, or making fun of him, or saying antagonistic things that when they come through the interpreter, they're missing the flavor and spice that the Russian language actually has. Sarcasm gets lost in the translation, literally. And so,
yeah. Well, and I would say I want to add the talking dynamic between them has always been 90-10. From every report we've gotten, 90% of the time, Putin is talking to Trump, which is knowing our dear leader, Trump. Isn't that crazy that a man that talks as much as he does unendingly, anytime he's asked a question by a reporter, he drones on and on. Anytime he does a rally, it's 3 hours long. Can you imagine Trump sitting in a room with Putin for 2.5 hours, silently listening to Putin talk to him for 90% of the time?
It's wild. It's wild.
It's wild.
But what I think is even more diabolical than, actually, to your point, your question, your sort of rhetorical question, how much is our White House being controlled? It's probably a lot, but it probably is not the way that you think. It's not like they're getting direct commands and instructions. All you'd have to do is be on the sidelines and say, "You going to let Europe do that?" Europe has been taking advantage of you this whole time. Haven't you noticed?
Yeah.
Right. That's all it takes. And
that's true. That's suggestive power. Yeah. And Putin's clever. He's coy and clever when he needs to be. He's direct and abrupt when he has to be. I could see that. And you're right. It's hard for the imagination to really to get an idea of what that dynamic looks like, right? It's just there's no movie I can reference or any bad guy scene for me really to have an idea of what this looks like, because in a movie a lot of times the villain has to spell things out for us, the audience, right? Like to be
Yes.
subtle and nuanced is it's tough. Like there are heady movies with nuanced villains, of course, but the traditional James Bond or Mission Impossible villain needs to be a lot more direct for the audience to get that they're a villain. So it's really hard for me to imagine it. I think you've nailed the essence of what it is. Now, our listeners might be thinking like, "Wow, listen to Pierce and Richard sound conspiratorial or whatever you want." But you have to understand, I'm just looking at this from who benefits the most from all of the decisions over the last couple
Mm-hmm.
months. If you know anything about international relations or of Putin and Russia's relationships with other countries, even, our combativeness towards Canada makes a lot of sense. There's a couple leaders with which specifically Putin fucking hates more than anybody else. And guess what? Trudeau was one of those fucking leaders, if you didn't know, because Canada has always taken a hard stance against Putin because they don't contribute much to NATO. They have us as their big brother in defense, and they could. So Trudeau, for the vapid empty bottle that Trudeau has been over the last 20 years, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I hear this criticism often, but he has been harsh on Putin. Um, I there's other people who have stood to gain, but if I'm thinking about the decisions that everyone has made that have been made over the last 3 months, there's really like three main people that stand to gain besides Trump. Trump is he's kind of a vehicle of he gains from everybody the whole time. And what I mean by that
Mm-hmm.
is he's very transactional. He is quid pro quo. For everything he's doing for each of these parties, he is getting paid, whether it's through crypto now or his meme coins or his own stock. These are, and now he can just take money for with just straight up hand over fist, right? But I think of the three winners so far from the Trump administration would be Putin, Bibi Netanyahu, and Elon Musk. These three individuals, I think, have gained more from this administration than ever before. And then, uh, not necessarily intended, but Xi Jinping also has won so wholeheartedly in these relationships. Those are the people that stand out the most. I mean, this new vehicle tariff, which I've been talking about for a couple of months, was absolutely going to benefit Elon Musk more than anybody else because, frankly, all the other auto manufacturers have to import and export between Mexico and Canada. Yeah, 60% of their goods. That's like the manufacturing process. There's just constantly goods going from like Michigan, Detroit, these areas right across the border, and then they come back. That's how our automobiles are manufactured. It's in conjunction with these two other countries. Um, Whereas Musk has most of his factories on stateside. So this wholeheartedly benefits him more than anybody else. Bibi Netanyahu, we don't need to really talk about how much he's benefited over the last 3 months, but oh my gosh, he must be the luckiest person on the planet, um, while being a genocidal maniac, which is crazy. Uh, Xi Jinping right now, I mean, I just read an article today that in the first time in 5 years, Japan and South Korea opened up talks with China to talk about considering more regional trade between each other because the U.S. is not a reliable ally. Can you believe that? That is incredible. There's, those sail arounds we talked about. Sorry, lastly, that sail around we talked about, unintended consequences.
I'm just pausing before I just want to acknowledge that when we talk about a global order, we talk about a globalized system of trade, we talk about this role that the United States played in the post-war era. If you want to get granular, we can find dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of the United States meddling in the affairs of other nations. Our recent favorite is the way that the United States meddled in the in Iran's affairs to become more democratic, right? Because doing so would stabilize the country more, and it would compromise some of the oil concessions that Great Britain had, right? So
Yes. Yeah.
there's lots of examples of the nation behaving despicably, our leadership behaving despicably in the last 80 years. Um, that said, one of the things that would I'm not interested in digging up my grandfather and asking him from the grave what he would think about this. But
We probably
if
wouldn't want
we
to know,
if we
right? No, I'm
had
joking. No, go
if
ahead.
we
Sorry.
put our put ourselves in the perspective of the generation that went up against the Japanese Empire in the Pacific, if we put ourselves in the shoes of um, the service members who went up against the Wehrmacht, Battle of the Bulge era
Yeah.
of World War II, the idea that Germany and Japan would rearm following the war, would be encouraged to rearm, would be put into a footing where they had to rearm, would probably be anathema, in my grandfather's opinion, if you asked him, because he was on the Missouri in World War II. He was at the signing of the ceasefire in Tokyo Bay. Right? He was one of those service members who had contact with that historical moment in history,
Did he fight in the
that
Marine? He
historical
was in the
moment.
Marines then? He was a Marine, I'm
He
guessing.
was a sailor.
Oh, he
He
was a
was he
sailor.
was
Okay.
a communications, radio operator in on the battleship Missouri.
Okay. My
Um,
uncle Pierce,
excuse,
he was a
excuse me,
Marine.
excuse me. Uh, let me walk that back. The Iowa and the Missouri are sister ships. Those are the two ships that are in Tokyo Bay.
Okay.
Marvin served on the Iowa.
Okay.
Sorry,
Gotcha.
I'm going to clarify that. Marvin served on the Iowa. He was a Republican his whole life. He probably would have voted for this administration if he was still with us. Um, but it would be really interesting to hear what he would have to say when he would be watching this unbelievable walk back of the strategic world that his generation fought to secure.
Yeah.
Now, a 19-year-old Marvin is not thinking about the Bretton Woods arrangements
Or
that,
yeah, or
that
the
were being
Marshall Plan.
negotiated
Yeah.
but by with Keynes and White, I think, are who I'm thinking of.
Yep.
Right? He's not thinking about these strategic um, uh, um, what is it's not guns and butter, but it's the Marshall Plan, of course. it's
Yeah.
it's how can we support these allies in whatever way that keeps them as a barrier to these despotic and terrible regimes that are coming out of the mid-century or the early 20th century, right? He wouldn't have that on his mind, but following the war, the Bretton Woods negotiations. I mean, Germany and Japan are flattened nations. These are destroyed nations.
Yeah.
The Bretton Woods Exchange gave these nations everything that they had ever that the former the emperor and the Führer had wanted.
Yeah.
Right? What they were striving for was this hegemony in their regions to be able to expand and have economic security.
Yeah.
And the Bretton Woods Exchange gave them that and more in global free trade. And all they had to do, the one thing they had to do was one, um, not have these fascistic, autocratic, right wing attitudes. So Germany did a very good job of tamping that down, or doing away with it entirely.
Well, we
Two,
forced them, but yes, yeah,
yeah,
they fell in line and they outlawed Nazism in Germany.
yeah,
They did those things. Yes.
and two, not not develop offensive capabilities in the military.
Yeah.
Right? West Germany had to rearm somewhat. I mean, that was part of the problem with being at the where the Fulda Gap opened up. That's Germany. The Fulda Gap is
Yeah.
this strategic place in Europe where we would expect an armor battle with the Soviet Union. We needed them to be, uh, uh, our favorite guy Peter Zane would say, we didn't need them to stand with us against the Soviets, but to stand in front of us, right?
Yeah.
That's the deal that we're offering here by setting their security policies. And what we've talked about today, what the realities of what we discussed today are wild to you and I because of the implications of what's happening when the United States, as a national body, and the administration of the United States, in every way, stands up and says, not only are we done holding up this global order, not only, we're done with that. We're going to try to push the world back into a situation that is the nursery for global conflict.
Yeah.
We're going to put the world back into a footing where global conflict is nearly guaranteed given our historical record.
Well,
And that's the wild thing that we're watching here.
there's a duality to it too, and we might have to talk about that in the next episode because we do have about 5 minutes left or so before we hit the hour, where not only are we pushing us back to pre-1920s-ish era global history, like global kind of scenario, but also internally. We are trying internally all of the labor protections that are being taken away. These tariffs on everybody. Smoot-Hawley was 1928, I believe, is when that was enacted. The deregulation of the banks, that was Hoover during that same period of time, openly was doing some shady shit with the banks, basically trying to bribe them to play along and crash the economy, which they didn't want to do because they were all greedy and were like, well, if you make me play along, then I could die and they'll all get, they'll all have banks still. And so there's a lot more to my terrible representation of that. But this idea that we should go back to the 1920s and 30s where there were no labor protections at all, where oligarchs were a thing. There were oligarchs. The antitrust laws had weakened since Roosevelt even, which led to the election of Woodrow Wilson to begin with, right? It was the whole reason why Teddy Roosevelt was trying to get back into office for, it would have been his third term, I believe. Because he had noticed that Standard Oil was reconsolidating after they had broken him up into about 6 different factions, and some of the other monopolies that had been broken up within the steel industry and others were all starting to consolidate again. And so this trend continued through the 20s. The shady new banking practices where you were able to take credit out and buy into the stock market. This was all new developments that happened that led to the economic situation the economics plight that we faced. Now it's the 2020s, and although there are similarities, there's differences as well. Like we can say, now I'm seeing the most rich man in the world can buy his own company from himself using another company of his. He can overinflate the value. And what I mean is he used XAI, which is a different company he has. This controls his Grok, his LLM. So far, there's been about $15 to $20 billion worth of investment in this company, but the banks valuated it at $75 to $80 billion because they get paid based on favorable valuations, by the way. I just want to say. So, 7 to 8 banks do these valuations and they come together and they're like, oh, yeah, it's worth whatever you want it to be worth. And Elon Musk was able to leverage that fake valuation, whatever, we're just making things up, to purchase his own company for $1 billion more than what he purchased it for, even though it's not valued at $44 billion. Well, I guess the banks did. They said, oh, now it's worth $45 billion. And essentially bail out his own companies with his own money. The last 10 years, maybe 15, companies have been able to take loans. If you're rich enough, you can take loans on your own stock and use that to make purchases. That's how he bought Twitter in the first place. He actually took loans and leveraged his own stock at Tesla to make the purchase of Twitter in the first place, along with some other shady investors from Saudi Arabia, Russia, and China. And so we're living in a world where there's all of this insane financial shenanigans, that things that you and I could never do. I couldn't just like say, oh, hey, I have a stock, it's worth this, and I'm going to take a loan out of this because I need to support my family or something like that. It's just, these are different rules. But the general theme is that we have exploitative predators, leaders who are exploiting every system in the game and stealing actively from us while we watch it happen. Maybe because they have no regard for our life. I know that to be true, but they have no understanding of history and what happened in the 1920s and 30s, the backlash that they could potentially have in the coming years. So that duality is striking.
They have parachutes on this flight. And the people that don't have parachutes are you and I.
And everybody else, the workers. Mm-hmm. On the next episode, Richard, I'd like to talk about what we can do to fight back. I've started to come up with a plan. Our viewers and listeners can get involved in it. It's a very positive thing. It's not a physical fight. Don't worry. I'm not causing a revolution, so to speak. But I'd love to chat about it a little bit. It has a lot to do with what the Heritage Foundation has been up to. So.
Oh, the good old Heritage Foundation. I miss talking about them.
Next episode, we can definitely talk about it. So if you've stuck with us for this long and you heard our doom and gloom, sorry for that, but not too sorry. Please like, share, and subscribe our episode. We appreciate our 50-ish viewers we're starting to get now. I don't know. The last episode's getting 7 to 8, so no one gives a shit about Oregon, apparently, besides you and me, Richard. But yeah, so...
It's quietly a lovely place to live. There aren't really any venomous creatures that live here. We don't really get terrible storms. That's a little seismic activity occasionally. It's kind of fun, but really, it's a pretty boring place to live.
That's right. We even have a town named after that. So,
Boring, Oregon.
Boring, Oregon. That's right. All right, Richard. Well, I've had a pleasure talking to you, and to all of our listeners, thank you for your support, and we'll see you next week.